At the end of January 1994, a heavy atmosphere hung over the small town of Jeanerette in Iberia Parish, Louisiana. Daylight shone behind a car wash facility where a man opened the lid of a metal dumpster and discovered something no one was supposed to find. "Center, I need the police here right away. I just found the body of a newborn baby behind my business." His voice trembled during the emergency call. What began as an end-of-day cleanup job had turned into something entirely different, something that would haunt Iberia Parish for more than 25 years. The body of a newborn baby girl, with no name, no documents, and no identifying marks whatsoever, left among the trash as if she had never existed. Investigators quickly determined the child had once lived and had only lived for a few hours before dying from being abandoned in the cold. For many years, this case remained a question with no answer. A life that began in silence and ended in silence, leaving behind a secret that no one could explain. At the end of January 1994, in the small town of Jeanerette in Iberia Parish, Louisiana, the afternoon gradually turned into evening in the familiar quiet atmosphere of an agricultural community, where local businesses began to close after a normal workday. Lights were turned on in various areas as the flow of people thinned out and the final activities of the day took place at their usual pace. Behind a car wash facility located in this area, the trash collection area was arranged separately from the front section, with little foot traffic and usually only accessed by the business owner or employees, with no signs whatsoever indicating that this place was about to become the scene of the serious incident. The business owner, while completing the final tasks of the day, went to the back of the property to check and handle the trash as per his regular routine, a simple task repeated every day with no unusual factors appearing beforehand. He approached a large metal dumpster, an industrial type with a capacity of about 55 gallons used to hold waste, and opened the lid with the purpose of checking the condition inside. As soon as he looked down, he realized the contents inside were not like ordinary trash. A motionless object at the bottom of the dumpster caught his attention, and upon closer observation, he discovered it was the body of a newborn infant placed directly in the dumpster, uncovered, with no protective layer around it, lying among other waste materials without any signs of being wrapped or handled carefully. The man stopped, kept his distance, and performed a preliminary check in a cautious state, noticing that this was a baby girl, a tiny body with the characteristics of a newborn, not wearing any special clothing, with no documents and no personal items accompanying it that could provide information about the child's identity or origin. The position of the body in the dumpster showed no intentional arrangement or concealment, but there was also no immediate sign indicating how the child had been brought there, or the exact time the body was placed in the dumpster. Realizing the serious nature of this discovery, the business owner did not approach further, avoided disturbing the scene, and quickly left the back area, leaving the dumpster in its initial state. He moved inside to the area with a telephone and made a call to the local law enforcement agency, directly and clearly conveying that he had just discovered the body of a newborn infant in the trash dumpster behind his business. Immediately after the call was made at the end of January 1994, the dispatch center of the law enforcement force in Iberia Parish, where the on-duty staff quickly received and classified it as a suspicious death case that might involve criminal activity, required an immediate response. The nearest patrol unit was dispatched to the scene in Jeanerette on that same day, while also notifying the relevant departments, including the crime scene technicians and the Iberia Parish Coroner's Office, to prepare to participate in processing the scene according to standard procedures. When the first officer arrived shortly after the call was made, the area behind the car wash facility remained exactly as it was when the discoverer left, with no obvious disturbance. And after approaching the designated dumpster, the officer confirmed that inside there was the body of a newborn infant, matching the initial description. Immediately, the surrounding area was treated as a potential crime scene and secured to prevent any interference that could affect the evidence. Crime scene boundaries were established with warning tape, restricting access to unauthorized personnel, and additional officers were deployed to control the area, ensuring no external intrusion during processing. The scene documentation process was carried out in standard order, beginning with determining the exact position of the dumpster in the property space, its distance from the main building, the entrances and exits, and the nearby public areas. Overall and close-up photographs were taken to preserve the initial state before any evidence was moved, including images inside the dumpster and how the body was positioned. Meanwhile, another officer conducted the initial interview with the person who discovered the body, recording details of the time he approached the back area at the end of the workday, the action of opening the dumpster, his reaction upon discovery, and the time he made the report call. In addition, the police asked about the work schedule that day, the last time this area was checked or cleaned before the discovery, and whether anyone else could have accessed the area in the preceding time period. This information was carefully documented to help reconstruct the sequence of events related to when the body was placed in the dumpster. Along with gathering statements, investigators began assessing the environment around the scene, including the ground surface, the position of the dumpster, any visible traces such as drag marks, footprints, or any signs indicating the movement of an object similar in size to the body. However, because this area was frequently used for trash collection and had daily movement, distinguishing old and new traces was very difficult. A preliminary timeline was built based on the initial collected data, combining the discoverer's statement with the environmental conditions at the end of January 1994 to estimate the time frame when the body was placed in the dumpster before being discovered. Environmental temperature factors, the initial level of decomposition, and the condition of the body were recorded to support determining the time of death in subsequent examination steps. Investigators also considered the possibility of access to the area from outside, including whether the dumpster was in direct view from the public road, whether there were any fences or obstacles preventing access, and whether a stranger could have brought the body to this position without being detected under the lighting and pedestrian traffic conditions at that time. These factors were analyzed to determine the level of risk the perpetrator faced when approaching the scene. At the same time, the police noted that in 1994, the area behind the facility was not equipped with a video surveillance system, which limited the ability to gather visual evidence of who had accessed the dumpster during the relevant time period. The body of the newborn baby girl was removed from the scene in Jeanerette at the end of January 1994 in its initial intact condition and transferred directly to the Iberia Parish coroner's office for detailed examination, where coroner Dr. James Falterman personally supervised the entire process to determine the cause of death as well as factors related to the circumstances of the death. The examination process began with a full recording of the external characteristics of the body, including sex, body length, estimated weight, skin condition, and biological development level, all of which indicated that the victim was a newborn who had been born very recently relative to the time of discovery. Important biological signs such as the condition of the umbilical cord, the presence of vernix caesosa on the skin, and respiratory features were carefully checked to determine whether the child had lived after birth, and the results clearly showed that this baby girl had breathed after being born, a key factor proving that this was not a stillbirth case but a live infant who had been abandoned. During the internal examination, no signs of serious trauma, such as broken bones, internal organ hematomas, or soft tissue damage from external force were found, which ruled out the possibility that the victim died from direct violent attack. Instead, indicators related to body temperature and tissue condition showed that the child had lost heat over a short period after birth, leading to severe hypothermia, which was determined to be the primary cause of death. The environmental conditions in the Jeanerette area at the end of January 1994, with nighttime temperatures that could drop to levels low for an unprotected newborn's body, were considered a direct contributing factor to the rapid heat loss, especially in the case where the child was not wrapped or kept warm. The forensic analysis combined with environmental data allowed the estimation that the victim had lived for a short period, possibly only a few hours after birth, before dying, a time frame sufficient to determine that the abandonment occurred in the period immediately after birth and that there was no adult care intervention whatsoever. These conclusions had important legal significance as they shifted the classification of the case from an undetermined death to a criminal act, specifically abandonment leading to death, often categorized as neonaticide in U.S. investigative and legal literature. Along with determining the cause of death, biological samples were collected from the body, including tissue and DNA samples, which were stored according to the standard procedures of 1994 for future analysis. Although at that time, the ability to use DNA to identify or trace relatives was still very limited due to underdeveloped technology and databases. The forensic report prepared by Dr. Falterman also noted that there were no signs that the child had ever been taken to a medical facility after birth, with no evidence of professional medical care. The focus of the investigation quickly shifted to identifying the child and tracing the biological origin based on the forensic conclusions established in Iberia Parish at the end of January 1994. As investigators began implementing a systematic review of the medical system in the area to search for any birth records that might be related, all hospitals serving the Iberia Parish area, including facilities in New Iberia and neighboring areas such as St. Trame, Mary Parish, and Lafayette Parish, were officially contacted to check birth data during the period from mid-January to the end of January 1994, with requests for information on female newborn births, especially cases with unusual signs such as premature birth, births outside regular hours, or patients who left early after giving birth. Hospital records were reviewed not only based on dates but also on the biological characteristics of the newborns, such as estimated weight, body length, and post-birth health status, to look for any matches with the recorded forensic data. At the same time, investigators also requested checks for cases of female patients admitted with signs of pregnancy but without corresponding birth records, a method aimed at detecting cases where individuals might have left the medical system before completing the process. Along with working with hospitals, the police expanded the review to private obstetric clinics and independent practicing doctors in the Iberia Parish area, where births might not be fully recorded in the official system. These doctors were asked about any patients who showed signs of pregnancy in the preceding weeks but did not return to give birth or had incomplete birth records, as well as home births with semi-official medical assistance. However, the results from these sources provided no matching information, with no records noting a missing or unaccounted for newborn baby girl in the relevant time period, and no reports of a mother leaving a medical facility without the child. Investigators continued to check additional data, including records from emergency care centers and non-specialized clinics, which sometimes handled unplanned pregnancies or non-standard births, but found no signs related to a birth matching the victim's characteristics. At the same time, authorities also reviewed police reports in the area from mid to late January 1994 to search for any information about abandoned, missing newborns or situations involving pregnant women with unusual behavior, but no reports were recorded. This included checking emergency calls, civilian reports, and community information, all of which provided no specific leads. Another check direction implemented was contacting social services agencies in Iberia Parish to determine whether there were any cases related to abandoned newborns or pregnant women in difficult circumstances recorded in the social support system, but the collected data also showed no links to the case. The failure to find corresponding birth records in the entire official and semi-official medical system led to an important conclusion in the investigation process. The child was likely born outside the medical system, in an unsupervised and unrecorded environment, which aligned with the previous forensic conclusions about the lack of signs of professional medical intervention during the birth. Investigators began considering the possibility that the birth had occurred in secret, possibly at a private location such as a home, where the mother did not seek medical support and did not notify any individuals or agencies. In the context of a small community like Jeanerette and New Iberia in 1994, concealing a pregnancy and giving birth without detection was assessed as difficult, but not impossible, especially in cases where the mother lived in isolation or had social circumstances allowing high privacy. The forensic conclusions about the time of death and the victim's biological condition became the basis for investigators in Iberia Parish to expand the search scope and begin constructing a detailed timeline around the period at the end of January 1994, when data showed the child had been born and died within a very short time frame, most likely only a few hours after birth. Based on this assessment, the investigation focus shifted to determining the specific time period when the mother might have given birth, then moved and left the body at the area behind the car wash facility in Jeanerette. Investigators used environmental temperature data, body condition, and the effects of hypothermia to narrow the time frame of death, estimating that the child was born within 24 to 48 hours before the time of discovery, meaning around mid to late January 1994, with a high possibility within 1 day before the body was placed in the dumpster. From there, the police conducted geographic zoning around the Jeanerette area and the neighboring city of New Iberia, which had higher population density and was within a reasonable travel radius for an individual who might carry a newborn without attracting attention. Residential areas, boarding houses, and medium-density population areas were added to the checklist, especially places that might allow a pregnant woman to give birth without detection. Investigators compiled a list of women of childbearing age residing in the area based on local population data and information from administrative agencies to identify individuals who might have been pregnant in the preceding period but showed no signs of a newborn after birth. Along with data analysis, direct interviews were conducted with local residents, including neighbors, landlords, store employees, and people who were regularly present in the area at the end of January 1994, with the goal of gathering information about any women who showed clear signs of pregnancy, but afterward no newborn appeared or exhibited unusual behavior such as disappearing for a short period and then returning without the child. The questions were designed to elicit small details such as changes in appearance, wearing unusually loose clothing, or avoiding social contact during the late pregnancy stage, signs that might indicate a concealed pregnancy. However, the results from these interviews did not yield reliable information, with most respondents not recording any cases matching the description or providing unverifiable information that did not lead to a specific investigative direction. Some scattered information about women who had been pregnant in the area was recorded, but when thoroughly checked, all had clear birth records or showed the presence of a newborn afterward, ruling out any connection to the case. Meanwhile, investigators also considered the possibility that the mother did not reside in the area, but only traveled there to leave the body, a hypothesis that expanded the investigation beyond Iberia Parish. But the lack of data on transportation, witnesses, or physical traces made this hypothesis unverifiable. The investigation timeline was built with key milestones, including the estimated birth time, the period the child was alive, and the time the body was placed in the dumpster. But these milestones existed only as theoretical frameworks based on scientific data, unable to link to any specific individual in the community. The efforts to expand the search scope and reconstruct the timeline based on forensic data and information gathered from the community in the first weeks of the investigation in Iberia Parish in early 1994 did not yield specific results. As investigators gradually faced the reality that they could not identify the victim's identity or the biological mother directly involved in the birth and abandonment of the child, although information sources from hospitals, clinics, social services agencies, and local residents had been thoroughly exploited, no records matched the characteristics of the newborn baby girl discovered in Jeanerette, and there were no reports of a missing or abandoned newborn in the period from mid to late January 1994. The interviews conducted in the community did not produce any direct witnesses who could confirm that an individual had brought a newborn to the area behind the car wash facility, nor any indirect witnesses providing reliable information about a pregnant woman disappearing or exhibiting suspicious behavior in the relevant period. Most of the collected statements were general, lacking detail or unverifiable, making it unfeasible to build an investigative direction based on witness accounts. Along with the lack of witnesses, the physical evidence collected from the scene also did not provide sufficient basis to trace the perpetrator, as the area behind the car wash facility was a space frequently used for trash collection, with continuous movement of people and vehicles, leading to traces such as footprints, drag marks, or other contact signs not being identifiable as directly related to the case. In 1994, the lack of a video surveillance system in the area further reduced the ability to reconstruct the perpetrator's movement or determine the exact time the body was brought to this position. The biological samples collected from the body, including DNA, were stored according to procedure but could not be used effectively at this stage due to technological and database limitations, as the CODIS system had not been widely implemented and there was no sufficiently large genetic database for comparison and searching connections. This made one of the most potential tools for identifying identity and biological relationships unusable at that time. Investigators continue to review all collected data, from the forensic report provided by Dr. James Falterman to the recorded statements and results from the medical system checks, but found no intersections that could lead to a specific suspect or a new investigative direction. Every hypothesis raised, including the possibility that the mother gave birth outside the area and then traveled to Jeanerette to leave the body, could not be verified due to lack of supporting evidence. By a few weeks after the case was discovered, around February 1994, the official investigation fell into a stalemate, with no new incoming information, no witnesses, and no sufficiently strong physical evidence to continue tracing. Investigative resources began to be adjusted, with gradually reduced intensity of activity at the scene and a shift to maintaining the case file in a monitoring state, awaiting the possible emergence of new information from the community or other data sources. In the context where the investigation in Iberia Parish in early 1994 had exploited nearly all direct information sources without achieving specific progress, the physical evidence collected from the victim's body began to be considered from a long-term perspective, especially the biological samples that could provide value in the future as technology advanced. During the autopsy process supervised by Dr. Seddon, James Balterman, tissue and DNA samples had been carefully collected and stored according to the standard procedures of that time, including preservation under controlled conditions to avoid decomposition or cross-contamination, with the goal of maintaining the integrity of the biological data for later analysis. However, in 1994, the ability to extract information from DNA in criminal investigations was still very limited, as genetic analysis technology was only applied at a basic level and was not widespread in local law enforcement agencies. The CODIS system, Combined DNA Index System, developed by the FBI to store and compare DNA profiles, was still in its initial implementation phase and had not been expanded nationwide, especially in areas like Iberia Parish, where technological infrastructure and resources were limited. The lack of a sufficiently large and diverse DNA database meant that even with a DNA profile from the victim, the possibility of finding a match with a specific individual was almost non-existent, unless the suspect had previously had a DNA sample taken in another case, which in this instance showed no signs of occurring. Investigators were well aware that although DNA had the potential to become a key tool in identifying identity and biological relationships, at that time it could not provide immediate answers, and DNA comparisons could only be performed when there was a reference sample from a specific individual, which they did not have due to the inability to identify a suspect. In addition, more advanced analysis methods such as forensic genealogy, which allow tracing biological relatives through civilian genetic databases, did not exist at all in 1994, making it impossible to use DNA to build family trees or determine indirect connections. Meanwhile, other physical evidence from the scene, which was already limited due to environmental conditions and the characteristics of the trash collection area, did not provide additional information that could support identifying the perpetrator, and there were no traces clear enough for in-depth analysis using the available forensic techniques at the time. Investigators conducted a re-evaluation of all collected evidence, from forensic data to scene evidence, but found no additional details that could open a new investigative direction under the technology conditions of that time. All exploitable information had been used, and what remained was mostly raw data that could not be converted into specific leads. In this context, the decision to store the DNA samples and related evidence became an important strategy, based on the assumption that in the future, when genetic analysis technology advanced further, this data could be effectively exploited to solve the case. The samples were sealed and stored in the investigative agency's evidence vault, with detailed records of origin, collection conditions, and preservation methods to ensure they could be reused without doubt about their validity. This storage was not only a technical step but also reflected the investigators' awareness of the limitations of technology at that time, as they had to accept that some questions could not be answered immediately and needed to wait for progress in forensic science. The clear limitations on evidence and technology in 1994 forced the investigation in Iberia Parish to shift to a less proactive state when all direct tracing directions had been exploited without yielding specific results. And according to the procedures of the local law enforcement agency, the case file was gradually reclassified as a cold case after there were no new leads to pursue. At that time, the case involving the newborn baby girl's body discovered in Jeanerette was officially stored in the unsolved case system of the Iberia Parish Sheriff's Office, where cases with unidentified suspects or victim identities were maintained for review when appropriate conditions arose. In the years following 1994, no significant progress was recorded related to this case, as community information sources provided no additional new data, and no individual appeared to identify or provide information about the child. Periodic reports were prepared to record the file status, but the content mainly confirmed that there were no changes in the investigative data. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, as law enforcement agencies nationwide began to apply DNA technology more widely, The case in Iberia Parish still had no opportunity to be solved due to the lack of reference samples for comparison, and although the CODIS system was gradually expanded, no DNA profiles matched the samples stored from the victim, making it impossible to determine identity or biological relationships. The physical evidence related to the case, including the tissue and DNA samples collected during the autopsy under the supervision of Dr. Sebely, James Falterman, was preserved in the investigative agency's evidence storage, where temperature, humidity, and environmental control conditions were maintained to ensure the integrity of the samples over a long period. Accompanying records clearly noted the collection date, preservation methods, and chain of custody to ensure they could be reused in the future without doubt about their legality or accuracy. For more than 2 decades, from 1994 to the late 2010s, this case existed in a nearly unchanged state, as the law enforcement agency's investigative priorities focused on new cases with higher solvability potential, while cold cases like this one were only reviewed when there was a specific reason or when new technology appeared that could bring hope. The initial investigators involved in the case were gradually replaced by a new generation, and information about the case mainly existed in archived reports, no longer part of daily investigative activities. However, the file was still maintained in the system, not fully closed, reflecting the policy of retaining unsolved cases for potential reopening when suitable conditions arose. During this period, there were no reports of an individual confessing or providing information related to the case, and there were no events in the Iberia Parish community that could be directly linked to the child's death. This caused the case to gradually become a typical example of a prolonged cold case, where evidence existed but could not be used to generate investigative progress. Significant advances in the field of forensic science, especially DNA analysis in the late 2010s, created a new context that caused many long-standing backlog files to be reviewed again, and in Iberia Parish, the file related to the newborn baby girl discovered in Jeanerette at the end of January 1994 was also brought back to the desk after more than 2 decades with almost no progress. Around 2018 to early 2019, the cold case unit of the Iberia Parish Sheriff's Office officially decided to reopen the investigation, based on the assessment that the biological evidence collected from 1994 could be exploited more effectively with modern technology. This decision did not stem from a new statement or the appearance of a witness, but entirely from new technical capabilities in handling DNA, especially the development of forensic genealogy methods, which allow investigators not only to search for direct matches in criminal databases, but also to identify distant family relationships through civilian genetic databases. The old evidence was retrieved from storage, including the tissue and DNA samples collected during the autopsy under the supervision of Dr. James Falterman in 1994, and re-examined to assess the level of preservation after more than 20 years. Experts confirmed that these samples were still of sufficient quality for analysis using modern techniques, opening the possibility of generating a much more detailed genetic profile than what could be achieved initially. The reanalysis process began with DNA extraction using improved methods, allowing more complete genetic data to be obtained from the stored samples, then building a complete DNA profile that could be used in modern comparison systems. Unlike in 1994, when DNA comparison was limited by the scale and scope of CODIS, by 2018-2019, the databases had expanded significantly, and genetic data processing capabilities had reached a level allowing analysis of more complex relationships. Investigators also began working with external experts, including laboratories specializing in advanced DNA analysis, to ensure that every aspect of the biological data was exploited to the maximum. This included preparing the data for use in genealogy platforms, where DNA samples could be compared with millions of voluntarily provided genetic profiles from the public. During this process, the case file was updated with all new information related to technology and analysis methods, while the old documents from 1994 were reviewed again to ensure no details were overlooked that could support the interpretation of new DNA results. Investigators also re-examined the entire previously built timeline, not to change the forensic conclusions, but to prepare for the possibility of linking genetic data with the geographic and time factors that had been determined. Reopening the file was not simply continuing an old investigation, but a process of restructuring the entire approach based on new technology, in which DNA became the center of all efforts, rather than just a potential piece of evidence as before. Preparatory steps were carried out systematically, from verifying the chain of custody to ensuring that every analysis process met current legal standards, to guarantee that any results obtained could be used in subsequent legal proceedings if necessary. The reanalysis process of the biological samples collected from 1994 was implemented in the 2018-2019 period, with a focus on maximally exploiting genetic information from what had been preserved in the Iberia Parish Evidence Vault, as forensic experts performed DNA extraction using modern techniques with much higher sensitivity than the methods used more than 2 decades earlier. The tissue samples taken from the newborn baby girl's body, which had been stored according to standard procedures since the autopsy under the supervision of Dr. Van James Falterman at the end of January 1994, were reprocessed in a strictly controlled laboratory environment to avoid cross-contamination and ensure data accuracy. The results of this process allow the creation of a more complete genetic profile, including DNA markers that could be used for comparison in modern systems, something that could not be achieved with similar detail in 1994. This profile was standardized according to current standards to be entered into databases and advanced analysis platforms. One of the important findings from the DNA data was the ability to determine the mother's genetic composition, as experts noticed that a large portion of the genetic information in the sample directly reflected the mother-child relationship, allowing the inference that the mother's DNA could be indirectly reconstructed through the child's profile. This opened up an entirely new approach, in which there was no need for a direct DNA sample from the initial suspect, but tracing could still proceed through biological relationships. The DNA profile was then entered into the CODIS system, which by this time had been significantly expanded compared to 1994, with millions of profiles from individuals who had been arrested or convicted nationwide. However, the comparison process did not produce any direct match results, indicating that the child's mother was not in the criminal database or had never had DNA collected in previous cases. The lack of direct match results forced investigators to reassess the DNA usage strategy, as it was clear that the traditional comparison method was insufficient to determine identity in this case, especially when the suspect had no history in the criminal justice system. In that context, the development of forensic genealogy became a viable option, allowing the search scope to expand beyond criminal databases and access civilian genetic data sources. Investigators began coordinating with genealogy experts to prepare the DNA data in a format suitable for family relationship analysis platforms, including converting the genetic profile into a form that could be compared with DNA samples voluntarily provided by the public through genetic testing services. This required a complex processing procedure including filtering and identifying DNA segments valuable for tracing distant family relationships. The shift to the genealogy method was not only a technical change, but also a turning point in the investigative approach, as instead of searching for a specific individual in a limited database, investigators began searching for indirect connections to biological relatives, thereby gradually narrowing the scope of suspicion. The victim's DNA profile, which previously could only be viewed as unexploitable evidence, now became the key to opening up a much larger information network. During this process, factors such as geographic origin, genetic characteristics, and potential family connections were incorporated into the analysis in parallel with the DNA data. To increase accuracy in identifying related family branches, experts use specialized algorithms and databases to identify individuals sharing ancestors with the victim, thereby building a list of families that might be related to the mother. The forensic genealogy-based approach was implemented immediately after the victim's complete DNA profile was prepared in a suitable format, as genetic experts collaborated with the investigative agency to upload the data to open database platforms where users voluntarily shared DNA information for research and relative tracing, a method that had begun to be widely applied in the United States in the late 2010s. From the initial match results, the experts did not find a direct matching individual, but discovered many distant genetic connections, often third or fourth degree relatives, indicating that the victim's DNA was linked to certain specific family branches in the Louisiana area. Based on these connections, an extended family tree was constructed by combining genetic data with civil records, including birth certificates, marriage registrations, census records, and other public data sources to identify relationships between individuals sharing ancestors with the victim. This process required tracing multiple generations, from common grandparents to scattered descendant branches, with the goal of identifying individuals likely within the generation appropriate for giving birth in 1994. The genealogy experts worked with investigators to gradually eliminate unsuitable individuals based on gender, age, and geographic location, focusing on women of childbearing age at the end of January 1994 who had genetic links to the identified family branches. Population data and residency records in Iberia Parish and neighboring areas such as New Iberia were used to narrow the list, as investigators prioritized individuals present in the area at the time of the crime. During this process, factors such as birth year, marital status, number of registered children, and residency history were analyzed in detail to identify cases that might have been pregnant without corresponding birth records in the medical system. Individuals with clear birth records or evidence of not being pregnant during the relevant period were removed from the list, helping narrow the investigation scope to a smaller group with potential direct relevance. Investigators also considered social and family connections, including whether individuals on the list lived near the Jeanerette area or had the ability to travel there at the end of January 1994 to ensure that geographic factors aligned with the previously built timeline. Throughout this process, the DNA data continued to play a central role, as each genetic connection was used to confirm or exclude specific family branches, and the family tree was continuously updated to reflect new findings. Experts used specialized software to manage and analyze thousands of potential relationships, thereby identifying intersection points between family branches that could lead to a specific individual. The combination of genetic data and administrative records allowed investigators for the first time since 1994 to link biological evidence to real individuals in the community, even if only indirectly, and each step of narrowing the scope was based on specific criteria to ensure the accuracy of the investigative process. The list of potential individuals was gradually narrowed through multiple rounds of genealogy analysis and cross-referencing with administrative records, ultimately leading investigators to a specific name when one family branch emerged with an appropriate level of genetic linkage and demographic factors matching the investigative hypothesis. That individual was identified as Sonia Charles, residing in the New Iberia area of Iberia Parish, Louisiana, not far from the location where the body was discovered in Jeanerette at the end of January 1994. Investigators began conducting a comprehensive verification of Sonia Charles's records, including birth year, residency history, and data related to her life at the time of 1994 when the case occurred. The data showed that at that time, she was of childbearing age and resided in a geographic area completely consistent with the previously constructed timeline. While no official birth records were recorded in the medical system related to a birth at the end of January 1994, the absence of these birth records aligned with the hypothesis of a secret birth outside the medical system, which investigators had raised from the early stages of the investigation but could not prove with data at that time. To strengthen the suspicion, investigators proceeded to collect a reference DNA sample from Sonia Charles according to current legal procedures, ensuring that the collection and analysis fully met the standards for evidence in criminal proceedings. This DNA sample was then sent to the laboratory for direct comparison with the DNA profile extracted from the victim's body during the 2018 MI9C reanalysis. The comparison results showed a genetic match at a level confirming the mother-child relationship, with the statistical probability high enough to rule out any random possibility, thereby confirming that Sonia Charles was the biological mother of the newborn baby girl discovered in the trash dumpster in Jeanerette in 1994. This finding marked the first time since the case was opened at the end of January 1994 that the victim's biological identity was determined through a direct relationship with a specific individual, while also providing a solid basis to shift from the investigation phase to determining criminal behavior. Investigators continued to review all data related to Sonia Charles, including medical records, personal history, and social relationships at the time of 1994, to determine the circumstances leading to the birth and abandonment of the child. Although there were no official medical records, indirect factors suggested a high likelihood that the birth had occurred under secret conditions, without professional medical support, and without notification to any agencies. This behavior was classified as neonaticide according to the legal definition, when a newborn is abandoned immediately after birth leading to death, consistent with the initial forensic conclusion by Dr. Cutts, James Falterman, regarding the cause of death as hypothermia due to lack of care. In addition to the abandonment, investigators also identified concealment factors related to the case, including the failure to register the child's birth, the failure to seek any medical support before or after birth, and the failure to notify authorities about the child's existence. These behaviors not only hindered the initial investigation, but also caused the case to fall into a state where identity could not be determined for more than 2 decades. The fact that Sonia Charles continued to live in the same geographic area without being detected for a long time demonstrated the effectiveness of this concealment in the context of limited technology. In 1994, when there was no mechanism to link an unrecorded birth with an unidentified body, the determination of the biological mother's identity through DNA analysis results in the genealogy investigation process created a legal basis for law enforcement to proceed with the next steps in the prosecution process. As investigators from the Iberia Parish Sheriff's Office completed the compilation of the evidence file, including genetic identification results, forensic documents, and administrative data related to the suspect, after the prosecutors reviewed and confirmed that the evidence met prosecution standards, an arrest warrant for Sonia Charles was approved according to the laws of the state of Louisiana. In September 2019, specifically in the early part of the month, according to information from the investigation file released afterward, law enforcement forces carried out the arrest of Sonia Charles at her residence in New Iberia, a city within the same Iberia Parish where she had lived for many years without being directly linked to the case that occurred in 1994. The arrest was carried out according to standard procedures, including notifying the suspect of her legal rights and ensuring the entire process complied with procedural requirements to protect the validity of the evidence in the prosecution phase. The timing of the arrest marked an important turning point in the case that had lasted more than 2 decades, shifting from a file with no specific suspect to having sufficient basis to identify an individual with a direct connection to the victim, based on DNA comparison results confirming the mother-child relationship between Sonia Charles and the newborn baby girl discovered in Jeanerette at the end of January 1994. After being arrested, Sonia Charles was placed into the detention system of Iberia Parish, where she was processed according to inmate intake procedures, including recording personal information, taking photographs, fingerprints, and a basic medical check. The temporary detention records noted her age at the time in 2019 as approximately 50 years old, consistent with her being of childbearing age in 1994 when the case occurred. Documents from the authorities showed that the arrest was only carried out after all scientific and legal verification steps had been completed, to ensure no factors could weaken the prosecution file in the subsequent phase, especially in a case that had existed for more than 25 years and largely depended on DNA evidence. During this process, investigators also reviewed the entire chain of custody for the evidence from 1994 to the present, ensuring that the DNA samples used in identifying the suspect had been stored and handled according to proper procedures, with no errors or violations that could be exploited during the trial. The fact that Sonia Charles continued to live in the same geographic area for a long time without being detected earlier reflected the limitations of investigative technology in 1994, when there were no tools capable of linking a secret birth to an unidentified body. Only when DNA technology and forensic genealogy reached their current level could this connection be established accurately and with legal value. After being placed into the detention system, Sonia Charles was held at the local jail in Iberia Parish, awaiting the next prosecution steps. The detention following the arrest in September 2019 opened a prolonged legal preparation phase, as prosecutors in Iberia Parish conducted a full review of the file to determine the appropriate charges based on the collected evidence, especially the DNA identification results and the 1994 forensic conclusions. This process required reevaluating the elements of the crime under Louisiana state law, including determining whether the abandonment leading to death met the criteria for the most serious charge. After nearly 2 years of file preparation and completing the necessary procedures, in May 2021, a grand jury in Iberia Parish officially reviewed the case and issued an indictment against Sonia Charles, marking the transition from the investigation phase to the formal criminal prosecution phase. This decision was based on presenting the evidence to the grand jury, including the DNA file confirming the mother-child relationship, the forensic reports prepared by Dr. Rolf, James Falterman, and all investigative data accumulated for 1994 until the file was reopened in 2018-2019. The charge brought was first-degree murder under Louisiana law, a serious accusation reflecting the prosecutor's view that the behavior of secretly giving birth and abandoning the child leading to death met the elements of the highest level of homicide, including intent or clear awareness of the possible consequences from one's actions. Applying this charge in a neonaticide case was not common. But in this instance, the prosecutors argued that the circumstances and consequences of the behavior were serious enough to prosecute at the highest level. After the grand jury issued the indictment, the case file was transferred to the trial phase, where the parties prepared for the court proceedings, including presenting evidence, calling witnesses, and building legal arguments, in which the DNA evidence played a central role, viewed as the key factor directly linking the suspect to the victim and ruling out any confusion about biological identity. The prosecutors worked closely with forensic and genetic experts to prepare detailed explanations of the DNA extraction, analysis, and comparison process, ensuring that the jury and the court could clearly understand the value and reliability of this evidence. This included presenting the chain of custody from 1994, the analysis methods used in the reinvestigation phase, and the scientific standards applied to confirm the results. In addition to DNA, supporting evidence such as the forensic conclusion on the cause of death due to hypothermia and administrative data related to the lack of birth records was also included in the prosecution file to reinforce the argument that the abandonment had directly led to the child's death. Meanwhile, the defense had the right to review all evidence and prepare arguments to challenge the validity or interpretation of this data, especially in a case where most evidence was based on science and there were no direct witnesses. Issues such as the reliability of the genealogy method, the possibility of DNA sample cross-contamination, or other factors related to the chain of custody could be raised for debate in court. The prosecution process also included determining legal issues related to the statute of limitations, although in the case of the highest level of homicide in Louisiana, there is no time limit for prosecution, allowing the prosecutor's office to proceed with the case even though more than 25 years had passed since the incident occurred. The case file was reorganized according to the structure suitable for court requirements, with documents from the initial 1994 investigation phase, the cold case phase, and the modern reinvestigation phase integrated into a continuous chain of evidence to prove that although time had passed, the core facts retained their value and could be used to determine the suspect's criminal responsibility. The prosecution process established after the grand jury's indictment in May 2021 placed Sonia Charles in the position of facing one of the most serious charges under Louisiana state criminal law, as the first-degree murder charge could lead to a life sentence without the possibility of parole if convicted. According to records released by the Iberia Parish Sheriff's Office and subsequent prosecution documents, the entire case was built on a chain of evidence spanning from the end of January 1994 to 2019, with the focus on modern DNA analysis results combined with the initial forensic conclusions by Dr. Sante James Falterman, bringing the case to trial after approximately 25 years from the time of the incident, was not only a notable time milestone, but also reflected a fundamental change in criminal investigation science in the United States, as evidence that could not be exploited in 1994 now became the central factor in determining identity and criminal responsibility. The investigation file recorded that without the advances in DNA analysis technology, and especially the forensic genealogy method in the 2018-2019 period, the case would most likely have continued to remain on the cold case list indefinitely. In the trial preparation process, the prosecutors focused on building arguments based on three main pillars: the DNA results confirming the mother-child relationship between Sonia Charles and the victim, the forensic data determining the cause of death as hypothermia due to abandonment immediately after birth, and the behavioral factors showing that the birth was carried out in secret without any medical intervention or administrative registration. Genetic experts were called to explain in detail before the court the process of extracting DNA from samples stored for more than 2 decades, how to build a complete genetic profile, and the method of comparison with the reference sample collected from Sonia Charles in 2019. They also presented the statistical accuracy of the results, showing a near-zero probability of error when determining the mother-child relationship. Along with that, the chain of custody from 1994 was presented as a key factor to prove that the biological samples were not cross-contaminated or degraded to the point of losing legal value, with documents clearly recording each step of storage, transfer, and reanalysis in 2018-2019. In the context of no direct witnesses and no traditional physical evidence such as fingerprints or traces at the scene, DNA became the sole decisive factor linking the suspect to the victim. and the entire prosecution strategy revolved around proving the validity and reliability of this scientific evidence. Legally, applying the first-degree murder charge in the case involving neonaticide reflected the prosecutor's view that abandoning a newborn infant under conditions with a consequence of death could be foreseen constituted a high level of intent, sufficient for prosecution under the most severe penalty framework. Under Louisiana law, this charge has no statute of limitations, allowing the prosecutor's office to proceed with the case even though more than 2 decades had passed since the incident occurred in January 1994. In addition to the court proceedings, the case also created significant ripples in the Iberia Parish community, especially in the Jeanerette and New Iberia areas, where the incident had once been recorded as an unidentified case for many years. Identifying the mother and bringing the case to prosecution brought a clear answer to an event that had existed in legal records for more than 25 years without a solution. The information released during the reinvestigation and prosecution process also highlighted an important factor in law enforcement work: the decisive role of preserving evidence in unsolved cases, as the DNA samples collected from 1994, if not stored according to proper procedures, could not have been used to identify the victim's identity and prosecute the suspect in 2019 and 2021. In internal summary reports, investigators emphasized that strict adherence to evidence preservation procedures had enabled modern technology to be effective, turning a case with no leads into a file that could be prosecuted based on scientific evidence. This also led law enforcement agencies to increase investment in evidence storage and management systems, especially for cold cases. At the same time, the case was also viewed as a typical example of applying forensic genealogy in criminal investigations, as this method allowed tracing suspects through family relationships rather than relying solely on traditional criminal databases, opening a new direction for solving long-standing backlog cases across the United States. If you're interested in cold cases solved thanks to modern technology like the story in Iberia Parish, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more detailed and accurate analyses. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video with another case still waiting to have its truth revealed.